Okay, I think we're going to get started. We've got 97 people online, and I think if you're turning up 5 minutes late, you're just walking in the door a bit late. So I'd like to welcome everybody here this evening to the Conservation Council and our wonderful co-hosts, so I'll come back to our Sustainable Transport Election Forum for the ACTR election. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Helen Oakey. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservation Council ACTR region. I'd like to start by acknowledging that today we meet on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and I'd like to acknowledge the contribution that they have made and that they continue to make to life in our region. We have so much to learn about the lands that we live on by listening to our First Nations people, and in particular with regards to land management issues across the ACT, where their knowledge and their understanding both grows our appreciation of what's gone before us, but will also help us going forward. I'd also like to pay my respects to any other Aboriginal people who might have joined us this evening from other places around the country, and our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Before we move to introducing our candidates and our co-hosts this evening, I'm just going to quickly run through some logistics. Obviously, the first one that is crucial, please, is as you come into the meeting, can you please put your microphone on mute? If you don't, and we do notice that it's not on mute and we've got background noise, Kirsten can actually just switch it on for you. So if you find that it has been switched on, that's probably what's happened. So I just quickly want to run through the structure of our event. So we will be starting with introductions and then take questions from our co-host groups, who I'll introduce in a second, and then we'll take questions from the floor. However, we won't be handing over the microphone to people in the event today. What we prefer that you did is to write your question into the chat bar. And if you can preface it with the word in capitals question and then write your question, that would be much appreciated. And then Kirsten, do you want to wave, Kirsten? Is on the, I don't know if everyone can see her, she's on the first screen. Kirsten will be picking up those questions and trying to collate them so that we can pull them into sort of a sensible format that we can put to candidates. You're very welcome to direct questions towards particular candidates and parties if you have something specific that you'd like to ask. And we do encourage you to keep your questions to issues of policy as best you possibly can. So that's basically logistics, just to let people know that the event is also being recorded and will be available for those who might have missed it. We'll have it linked up into our YouTube channel and send the link around to all participants afterwards. So for nearly 40 years, the Conservation Council, a little bit about us, has been advocating on behalf of our local environment, but also, as all local advocates know, our global environment, because that is part of where we sit in that context. We campaign in the ACT and the region for a safe climate, to protect biodiversity in our urban and natural areas, to protect and enhance our waterways, reduce waste, and promote sustainable transport and planning for our city. We seek to influence governments, and we like to build widespread support with business and the community to deliver our environmental outcomes, putting forward evidence-based solutions and also innovative ideas for how we can live more sustainably. So what I'd like to do now is introduce the co-hosts for our events. And if you'd like to unmute as I introduce you and say hello so that people can see where you are. If you have your speaker view on, then the person who's speaking will pop up on the screen. If you have your grid view on, you'll be limited to whoever's closest to you when you logged in. So if you'd like to put speaker view on, then you will hear the main speaker. You will see the main speaker as they're speaking. So I'd like to start by welcoming our co-host today. We're very excited that this year we have introduced a couple of new members to the Conservation Council. But we also see these organisations as partner organisations in our advocacy work. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Ryan Hemsley, who is the Chair of the Public Transport Association of Canberra.
Good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ian Ross, who is the CEO of Pedal Power. Oh, sorry, went too fast, sorry. Public Transport Association of Canberra's Public Transport Users Group, and they're focused on improving access to public transport and making the passenger experience better. Ian Ross is the CEO of Pedal Power. Pedal Power is ACT is Canberra's largest cycling organisation, representing around 7,800 members, and they advocate for better cycling infrastructure across the region. Ian?
Hello, and yes, thank you very much for coordinating and organising tonight, and we're looking forward to it.
Peter Campbell is the Policy Coordinator for the Australian Electric Vehicle Association, ACT branch. The Australian Electric Vehicle Association is a volunteer-run, not-for-profit organisation dedicated to the cause of switching Australia's transport networks to electric as quickly as possible. Peter?
Hello.
There you are.
Thank you.
And finally, Murray Lawton, who is the chair of Living Streets Canberra. Living Streets Canberra is a local community group that advocates for all Canberrans to enjoy public spaces and to be able to walk safely, easily and convenient to local destinations. Murray, would you like to say hello?
Good evening, everyone.
Great. And then finally to our candidates without whom we wouldn't be here tonight. So thank you very much for coming. I'd like to start by introducing Chris Steele, his MLA, who's from the ALP or ACT Labor, candidate for Murrumbidgee and the Minister for Transport. Chris, you just going to give us a wave there from the bus. Our second candidate, Emma Davidson from the Greens, candidate for Murrumbidgee. Candice Burch, MLA from Canberra Liberals and the candidate for Kurrajong and also the Shadow Minister for Transport. And finally, Robert Knight, candidate for Murrumbidgee from the Canberra Progressives.
Hello.
Great, thank you all. We really do appreciate your time. We know it's a really busy time for you at the moment with an election running, but of course this is what it's all about, is actually being able to talk to people who are interested in issues about the issues that you're putting forward and the policies that you're taking to the election. Before we move on, I just wanted to flag with people that on the Conservation Council website, you'll find a lot of information about our election platform and the priorities that we have put forward to all of the political parties. Thank you, Oakey. I should hold this up. And we've broken it down on our website into all of the different issues. And also people who registered for the event tonight would have received an attachment, and that attachment includes the key transport policy issues that were developed up in collaboration with all of our member groups over the last 6 months in the lead up to the election. So Canberrans transverse the city daily for social, recreational, household employment activities. Transport emissions contribute 60% to the ACT's direct greenhouse emissions, which fair and square puts transport in currently as an environment issue as well. And that 60% is primarily through the use of petrol and diesel vehicles. Our transport choices have a significant impact on our environment, the livability of our city, and our productivity, our health, and our well-being. We need to build a strong public transport network and enable active transport as a viable and attractive option for commuters, reduce emissions from the use of cars, and transition to an electrified transport system, which can then run on 100% renewable electricity. We need to think ahead about reducing traffic congestion and using our land wisely in the face of pressures to expand our urban footprint. So without further ado, I'm going to throw the floor, or actually I'm going to throw the first question to our candidates. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the top of the list, work my way down, and then for the next question, we'll start the next person down and we'll rotate the speakers in that order, if that's okay. So the first question is a fairly general one. So noting that all major parties have declared support for the target of zero net greenhouse emissions by 2045, and that transport does make up 60% of the ACT's emissions currently, what are the key actions that your party supports to reduce emissions from the transport sector? I'm going to throw to Chris Steele to open the responses.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having the forum. I'd like to start by firstly acknowledging the Ngunnawal people on whose lands we're meeting tonight in various locations across the ACT and perhaps elsewhere. Acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. Well, over the last few months, Labor Party in government has been outlining our transport plan through the transport strategy, which we've released to the public following consultation. And we've now also released our plan to tackle emissions in public transport Of course, in government, Labor built the first stage of light rail, which has been incredibly successful in a couple of ways. Firstly, it's meant that 20% of all of the trips that are taken on public transport are zero emissions trips. What it's also done is encourage more patronage on public transport. We've seen a 30% growth in the number of people using public transport in Gungahlin alone as a result of light rail. Much higher than what we had under the what was quite a successful Red Rapid route, if people remember that bus route that it replaced. We've also made sure that we're starting the plan to transition every single diesel and compressed natural gas bus to a zero emissions bus. We'll do that as Labor has outlined at the beginning of this campaign, to purchase 90 electric buses over the next 4 years, and also build the infrastructure that is actually required to make this transition operationally successful and to grow our fleet. And what that will mean is we'll build a new bus depot in the north of Canberra. We'll upgrade Woden to make sure that it's electric. We'll provide interim charging solutions in the meantime, and we'll also skill every single diesel mechanic to make sure that they can work on electric buses and make that successful. We'll also be outlining further plans in relation to private vehicles throughout the campaign.
This is where I get into trouble. Thanks, Chris, for that. I'm going to throw to Emma Davidson from the Greens.
Thank you. Look, I'd also like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal land that I am calling you from today. Look, I don't think it would be any surprise that the Greens really want to encourage people and support them to move to zero emissions transport as soon as possible. One of the ways in which we want to do that is to make sure that we leave no one behind, that even when an average number of trips on public transport is increasing, that we're also making sure that there are no gaps where there are people who want to be able to use public transport but can't actually get access to it in a way that works for them. So we do actually believe that now is the time to build a sustainable and integrated transport network for our 21st century city. At the moment, we've got fewer people using our roads, we've got low interest rates, we've got a lot of people needing jobs. So now looks like a really good time to be making those kind of infrastructure changes. We want to create options by removing barriers so that people have got more options available to them about how they move around the city that are zero emissions. So we can do that by increasing the number of people using electric vehicles rather than fossil fuel powered vehicles, making sure that our walking and cycling paths are safe for everyone in our community to use, and increasing our infrastructure there. We want to have more buses that are running in our suburbs, and we want a well-planned next stage of light rail. We also want to make sure that it's accessible to everyone by having an access committee to make sure that people with disabilities are able to use our transport systems, whether that's walking and cycling paths or our public transport systems. And we believe that by doing all of these things, we can massively reduce the percentage of carbon emissions coming from transport.
Great, thanks, Emma. I'd like to throw to Candice.
Hi, thanks, Helen, and thank you for hosting us all tonight. It's great to be here. The Canberra Liberals are, of course, committed to our 100% renewable targets and to our zero emissions targets as well. We believe that we need to achieve this by allowing people to make the best choices possible and encouraging more people to be using public transport, to be using active travel. We have had a couple of big announcements over the last couple of days relating to cycleways. We want to ensure that by 2030 we have separated cycleways that do connect all of our town centres and our major employment hubs to encourage more people onto their bikes, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. Yesterday, I also announced an expansion of transit lanes across Canberra. So we want to allow people travelling in cars with 3 or more people to be able to use bus lanes in peak times. And we think this will go a long way to encouraging more people to carpool, which is another major way that we can reduce emissions by getting people into one car instead of taking multiple cars. So those are just some of the things that we have announced so far, and there will be a couple of more announcements to come in the next few weeks. It is, however, very disappointing for many Canberrans that it is the Labor Greens government who over the last 18 months have pushed so many Canberrans back into their cars. The changes that we've seen to the transport network have resulted in cuts to dedicated school services, cuts to commuter expresso services, and as a result forced a lot of Canberrans back into their cars. We have also seen patronage fall in some areas of our city like Woden, Tuggeranong and Belconnen. So we definitely need to be fixing the transport network so that we're making it as easy and convenient as possible for people to use public transport.
Great, thanks, Candice. And now I'm going to throw to Robert Knight.
Thanks, Helen. Great to go last in this these sorts of questions. Listen, there's not much I can add more to what the former other 3 candidates have said in regards to cleaning up transport. I think Chris Steele's obviously outlined how we're electrifying our bus fleet, which is a great way to go. Obviously, the light rail being electrified. And the bicycle network that Candice has just announced, and also Emma has talked about in the past as well, is a fabulous idea. One of our key ideas about reducing our emissions from transport is to rebalance our transport away from the private motor vehicle use towards more active and public transport. So one of the key things that we'd like to be seeing is an integrated approach between active and public transport. So integrating cycle lanes and cycle facilities with our public transport networks, particularly trunk routes, etc. So they're the kind of things that we'd like to see. Another thing we'd like to see with the public transport system is have it turned into a network as opposed to the hub and spoke kind of model that we have at the moment. I think that we can take some exemplars from around the world and try and emulate their examples. So we do get a better coverage and better rapidity in the nature of the service. Yeah, that's all from me.
Great, thanks, Robert. So I am going to throw to Ian Ross to ask the next question on behalf of Pedal Power. And just so that you, the candidates know, I'm just rotating the order of answering the question at the moment. So Emma, the first one's going to go, this one goes to you first. Thanks, Ian.
Thank you. There has been some great recent investment in cycling infrastructure in the ACT, but our cycling commuting rate has not budged for 3 years, from 3% in years. No one expects all Canberrans to cycle every trip, but we know that getting more people to cycle is the key to reducing our transport emissions, improving population health, and improving individual and community well-being. So my question is, how will you change Canberra's car culture to support more Canberrans to ride?
That's a great question, thank you. Look, Canberrans have made it pretty clear that they do want better walking and cycling options. You know, one example of that would be the Canberra bicycle shops that sold out of bicycles in the early months of the COVID crisis. So now that all these people have got bicycles or they've got their old bike fixed and ready, what they're looking for is a good path to ride it on. And we know from research in Australia that one of the barriers to riding a bicycle is whether you feel safe to ride your bicycle on the path network that you've got. Now, we've got a great start to our network in Canberra, but there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of patches where there isn't an alternative to riding on the road. And we're also seeing some congestion on shared paths with pedestrians and bicycle users needing to share the space. So look, we've been taking suggestions from hundreds of Canberrans and we've mapped a lot of the gaps in that cycling network and we've made that map public so anyone can see, you know, who's suggesting improvements to our paths and where we've already got a lot of suggestions coming in. We've identified over 100 potential areas for improvement across the city. And so what we're planning to do is over the next 4 years to allocate a minimum of 20% of the roads and parking upgrade budget to walking and cycling at a minimum of $20 million a year. We believe that that's going to be necessary to get that infrastructure up there and to make sure that we've got cycling paths that are separated from the roads by more than just a painted white line, so that everyone can feel confident to get out there and make use of that space, take some of the congestion off the shared paths, and make cycling as a way of commuting around our city a lot quicker and easier and safer. So that's basically where we'd like to start.
Great, thanks. I'm going to throw to Candice.
Yeah, so as I mentioned today, the Canberra Liberals announced our cycle road free by 2030 policy. So what that will mean is that we're going to complete the separated cycle path network across our city to connect all of our town centres and our major employment hubs so that you can cycle to and from work without having to use major roads by 2030. Part of our announcement today also includes updating the Transport Canberra Journey Planner to give cyclists the option to select on-road or off-road, so that if you do have a preference for off-road, it will make it easier for you to plan your journey to only use off-road cycle paths. And we have also announced $5 million to go towards infrastructure and facilities at our transport hubs. So that will include things like bike lockers, storage lockers as well, and change rooms. Because again, two of the most, as Emma mentioned, two of the most common things that we hear from people as to why they don't choose to cycle to commute is because they don't feel safe on major roads. They don't feel safe when there is a bicycle lane just separated from cars with a white line. And from women in particular, we hear that it's the change rooms that are the issue, the lack of change rooms that just make cycling as to commute just much too difficult. So that is our big announcement today. It is ambitious. However, the Labor Greens government have failed to meet their bike path targets over the last couple of years. So over the last 2 years, they've met less than 40% of their targets for our bike paths. So that is why we think that we do need such a significant investment and ambitious target.
Sorry.
Helen.
Yeah, Robert, your turn. Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
no worries at all. Yeah, so look, I'm really impressed with what the Liberals' policy announcement was today. It's something that the Canberra Progressives have been advocating for a very long time, me personally, and it's from speaking to Emma, it's something that the Greens have been pushing for a long time. Yes, making cycling safe, accessible and easy is critical in raising the cycling commuter ratio, basically. I like the idea of learning lessons from the Dutch, who over the course of 40 years have transformed their cities from car-dependent, car-clogged messes to people-friendly cycling cultures, where it is extremely welcoming and a fun place to be. I think Canberra can do that. So one of the key things we'd like to see is a reprioritisation of the transport hierarchy. We have to slow vehicles, motor vehicles, through our suburban areas. We've got some of the highest suburban speed limit in the world. I think this is something that we need to do. We need to look at to address the safety of vulnerable road users. And that's besides an integrated and off-road, separated and dedicated right-of-way for cyclists. Oh gosh, I've lost my train of thought. But yes, making it such that an 80-year-old or an 8-year-old can get out and ride their bike to and from where they need to be, and any place in Canberra is absolutely important. So let's do it.
Thanks, Robert. I'm going to throw to Chris.
Sorry. We need to continue to build the cycle network out, particularly addressing some of the strategic missing links in our cycle path network. Over the last 4 years, Labor's in government has invested over $37.5 million to build some of those strategic links, many of which are under construction right at the minute on Corinna Street, Belconnen Bikeway, on the Hyson Street link, and the tender's just gone out last week for the Kurrajong cycleway improvements as well. So we'll continue that approach if we're re-elected by investing in the key strategic cycle links that will make it easier to get around Canberra. Those links have been identified by stakeholders, and we will be investing millions of dollars to deliver those, as well as maintaining the existing 3,000 kilometres worth of paths that we have in Canberra, many of which are cycle paths. So the investment in maintenance is something that I've heard we need to be ramping up, and that's something that we'll certainly be looking at as part of our policy in this election campaign. And that contrasts from an announcement from the Liberals today of just $500,000. $500,000 will get you less than half a kilometre of cycle path. We will invest millions, or if not tens of millions, to build out the cycle path network, and also to maintain the existing cycle paths that we have, to make sure that when you do cycle around Canberra, you're not coming up against roots destroying the pavement, that we've got smooth cycleways that people want to use, so that it's attractive to use. And over the last few months, we've demonstrated through the Fast Track Stimulus Program, building over 50 footpaths, but also putting in street lighting in key areas around the city to improve safety, and make sure that all people in our community feel like they can feel safe and use our cycle paths, and also public transport stops as well. As part of our urban forest strategy, we've also identified planting trees. So we've got shadeways along our key cycleway routes as a key action that we need to undertake as well, to make sure it's more accessible, and but also cooler during the summer to undertake cycling and walking.
Sorry, if I could just correct the record there. The $500,000 that we announced today was just for the design and feasibility study. We do realise that our commitment is going to cost a lot more than that, but that is something that we are committed to achieving over the next 10 years.
Then commit the money and tell us which cycle lanes you'll build.
Okay, I'm going to intervene. Thank you all. So I'm going to throw, the next question is from Ryan Hemsley from the Public Transport Association. And Candice, you're up to answer this one first.
Thank you, Helen. I have a very simple question. Will your party be committing to extending Canberra's light rail network?
Candice, I think you're still with us, but you might be on a different device.
Yeah, so change devices, but over here.
Right, okay, good, that's all right. I had a feeling you were doing that. Can you still hear us okay?
Yes.
Excellent, okay, so did you hear the question?
Yes, yeah.
Right.
The Canberra Liberals are absolutely committed to expanding light rail. Now that we do have light rail, we do want to see it be successful, and we do want to see it expanded into a network. However, we do want to conduct independent analysis to decide what the next best route is going to be, to make sure that it's the right route, it's done at the right time and at the right cost. The government is still not being transparent with Canberrans about what analysis they have done, about the business case, and about the costs that are going to be involved with future stages. I mean, anecdotally, a lot of people say to us, what about Belconnen through the city and out to the airport? That seems to make the most sense as the next route. And we still haven't heard from the government as to why that's not the case. So we want to be certain that the route and the money that we're committing to is the right investment decision for Canberra, and it's not simply about chasing votes.
Thanks, Candice. I'm going to throw that question to Robert now.
You'll have to forgive me, my kids have just entered the room, so there might be a bit of background noise.
I'll just come back to you.
No, it's all right. I can answer the question quickly. Yes, the Canberra Progressives would commit to extending the light rail network across the ACT. Of course, the business cases need to be examined, and they need to stack up. But we think that that rail-based transport is the preferred type of technology to use for the trunk routes that we'd be looking for across the public transport network in the ACT.
Great, thanks, Robert. I'm going to throw to Chris.
Thanks. Labor's absolutely committed to bringing light rail south of the lake to Woden, and we'll get on with the job of building it if we're elected. This is a critical project, not only to create jobs during this period, thousands of jobs that we really need in the recovery from the pandemic, but it will provide the same benefits that it has on the first stage, which has been hugely successful, to the south side. And we're committed to expanding it beyond, with pre-feasibility work underway on stages 3 and 4. We've released and provided an unparalleled level of transparency by releasing the business case for stage 2A with the BCR numbers, and there has been a cost that's been provided for light rail stage 2, which has been released in the budget update just a few weeks ago. So there's no excuse for the Canberra Liberals now. We've just heard that they're not committed to the extension to Woden. They want to look at Belconnen. We need to deliver this to all parts of our city, and that means a north-south spine to Woden.
Great, thank you, Chris. This is great. We're smashing through these questions, which means we'll have more time to answer all the questions that are flowing in on the chat bar. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. If you've put one that's already been asked, we probably won't put it, but we will try and consolidate them into themes and bring them back to people. So, Emma, over to you.
Look, it won't surprise anyone to hear that the Greens are, of course, committed to expanding the light rail network. We do believe it needs to come across the lake. If Tuggeranong's ever going to get light rail, it's got to cross the lake at some point. So let's work on that. Look, the Greens have always been committed to light rail. We were the first party to say yes to it. The way in which light rail is delivered is really important. We need to make sure that light rail is something that is accessible to the maximum number of people, and that means looking at things like express light rail services between Woden and the city. It also means making sure that the paths that connect and integrate our light rail with our walking and cycling network and park and rides and bike and rides are also very accessible and safe. So it's about lighting and upgrading those paths and activating the area around light rail stops as well, so that they're safe at all times of the day and night. It's very important that the community is able to be well consulted, and so having something like an access committee and making sure that people with disabilities and people with different experiences of using public transport can contribute to the next stage, so that we can learn from what we did in stage 1 is going to be very important to getting the next stage right.
Great, thanks so much, Emma. Okay, so that was just an opener on light rail. There's a lot of questions coming up about light rail in the chat bar, so we might throw to those a bit later. I'm going to throw to Murray Lawton from Living Streets Canberra to ask the next question.
Fantastic. So our key question for tonight is the ACT has a goal of Canberra being Australia's most walkable city. So too does Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. Queensland was the first to have a plan to get there. But our main question is, what will you do to make Canberra be Australia's most walkable city? And how will we know Canberra is winning the race?
So I'm going to throw to Robert to answer this question first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So it's no secret that Canberra's a car-dependent city. We've had around about 70 years of car-dependent growth. So transforming it back into a walkable place is going to take a bit of effort and some time to get there. However, we've got to start somewhere. So where I would envisage us starting would be with our town centres. We've got a nice sort of satellite city concept in the ACT. So my thoughts on it would be to not totally pedestrianise, but certainly transform our town centres into highly welcoming places for people on foot. So that means turning it away from being a car dependent location and transforming it into highly walkable places. So pushing the car parks out onto the periphery, maybe putting them into a multi-storey sort of development, Texas donut style multi-storey development with uses on the outside of that. So we're removing cars from the street, removing cars from wide open car parks, and creating welcoming streetscapes with decent street furniture, street trees, good well-designed town squares where people can congregate and feel welcome in. So I think that's the place to start, and then we can work outwards from there. Certainly a lot of our footpaths in our older suburbs are in dire need of some maintenance. So I welcome the announcement by Minister Steele that there will be some money put towards repairing that network.
Great, thanks, Robert. So, Chris, if you'd like to respond to that question.
Thank you. I think Robert's on the money there. We need to make sure that there's high quality footpaths, good seating, safe opportunities for people to cross the road, and clear priority at intersections as well. And what we've committed to do is we need to look at best practice from around the world around intersection design, but also around the design of protected cycleways. We'll use the movement in place framework that we've outlined in the transport strategy to help guide what the infrastructure is appropriate, what type of place infrastructure is required in each location. And we're looking forward to doing that, working closely with the stakeholders that are here present this evening and others throughout the community to see how we can improve that. So a lot of that is outlined in the transport strategy, and we're really committed to getting on with that work.
Great, thanks, Chris. I'm going to throw to Emma.
Yeah, look, a lot of the things that make a city walkable are actually about making sure that people are able to live close to the destinations that they go to. So while some of the things that make a city more walkable come out of transport packages, some of it actually comes out of planning, and we will be releasing a planning package soon that talks about those things. We need to work more closely with the community to make sure that we're planning our neighbourhoods so that people can access more of the things that they need to do in day-to-day life within their local area, so that we can have more of those under 5 kilometre trips and less necessity to travel across the city and a longer trip. Something else that is really useful about having Greens in the Assembly is that over the last 5 years, our Greens advocacy means that we've increased the expenditure on maintenance for paths by around 40%. But we do think that there's a lot more work to be done, and we would support Pedal Power's calls for a more strategic approach and greater transparency on paths maintenance. We want to make sure that our neighbourhoods are safe for everyone to walk around. It's something that I personally have done some social research work on in my previous employment, and I've learned a lot from that, from hearing from a lot of women about what makes a path feel safe for them to walk on after dark. It's not necessarily putting up CCTV cameras and things like that. It's actually just really basic things about lighting, wide footpaths, being able to see who's in the area, and having paths that go in front of houses where you've got lots of surveillance, passive surveillance from people in houses, rather than paths that go behind big apartment blocks or behind areas where no one can see if you, say, have a fall or if something happens and you need help. So all of those things contribute to making a city more walkable, and we're very committed to making that happen.
Great, thanks so much, Emma. I'm going to throw to Candice now for just wrapping up that question on walking.
Thanks. Yeah, I think everyone has made very valid points on what needs to happen. It's all about making it easier, more convenient for people to walk, and that includes upgrades to our footpaths, making sure we have footpaths, giving people, pedestrians, priority at traffic lights and speeding up so that they're not waiting as long as at traffic lights. And absolutely, as Emma said as well, I think street lighting is a really, really big part of that, particularly for women and vulnerable people walking in our suburbs. So they are all definitely things that we need to prioritise. The Canberra Liberals will have much more specifics to say on this when we release our city services policy in the next few weeks.
Great, thanks so much, Candice. Okay, so our last question from our co-host, the Australian Electric Vehicle Association, comes from Peter Campbell. Peter, I'll throw to you. And Chris, you're first up to answer this one.
Thank you. The Electric Vehicle Association encourages electrification of all types of motorised transport. However, this particular question is about our cars. Noting that fossil fuel vehicles can remain in use for decades, that the bulk of our transport emissions are from private car use, but that private vehicles are also likely to remain popular regardless of the wild success of all the other policies. What proposals does your party have to ensure that our emissions from the transport sector will be reduced to zero in the requisite timeframe?
Thanks, Peter. And in government, Labor's of course outlined, and the ACT government has outlined our approach in the Zero Emissions Vehicle Action Plan, which has included wiping stamp duty, providing discounts on registration, a whole range of measures which have meant that we are, in terms of the financial support that we provide, the most generous in Australia. And that is something that we absolutely need to continue to do. Labor will be outlining our full policies in relation to the transition for private vehicles in the coming weeks. But one thing that I have been advocating for as Transport Minister in national forums with my colleagues from other states and also the Commonwealth is that we need to make sure that we're actually introducing fuel emission standards here in Australia. We won't get the sort of change that we're seeing in Europe unless we actually take that action. And I'm absolutely committed that if Labor is re-elected, that we will advocate very strongly and run a campaign to actually get this done. It's something that the federal Liberal government completely refused to act on. But if we're going to get the change that we want to see and see more zero emissions vehicles on the road, that's what needs to happen, in addition to the incentives from hopefully not only state governments but also from the Commonwealth as well. Clearly, charging stations are a key thing to make sure that we can lessen range anxiety. So more charging stations. We're doing that in infrastructure projects that we're building, like the new CIT, which will have 25 new charging stations in it when it's built in Woden. So that's going to be critical to make sure that people feel supported. But unless we get those national policy settings right, it's going to continue to mean that manufacturers like Renault aren't prepared to sell their cars like the Zoe in Australia, which they've just pulled from our market. We need that to happen. We are concerned about being a little bit too generous towards people who are at the wealthier end of the income spectrum in relation to vehicles. What we'd really like to see is further action in relation to regulation here. Governments have a role to play in actually regulating to tackle vehicle pollution. And this is one area where that is the best solution, in addition to targeted and fairly provided incentives.
Great, thanks, Chris. I'm going to throw it to Emma.
Okay. Well, look, we absolutely want to support the transition to electric vehicles. There are ways in which government can support that to happen. So we've put out an EV, Canberra's Revolution, EV policy that sort of talks about some of the ways in which we can do that. So we want to adopt a target for 90% of new car sales to be zero emission by 2030. By doing that, we'll end up with more electric vehicles ending up in the second-hand market as well, and that makes it more accessible for people buying lower price cars as well. We want to create a $50 million fund to provide financial incentives to people, businesses and the not-for-profit community sector to purchase zero emission vehicles to replace their fossil fuel vehicles. This is particularly important for things like the community sector, where it's also about the maintenance cost and the ongoing fuel costs as well. So it's a really helpful thing for them. We want to transition to zero emissions public transport. We could stop buying diesel buses right now. We want to also have zero emissions garbage trucks. We want our taxis and ride shares to be zero emissions. And we want to do that by 2035. We want to expand the network of recharging stations across Canberra and the region, and we want multi-unit residential and commercial buildings to have those charging infrastructure built into them. We want to attract zero-emission vehicle industries to the ACT. This is a great economic opportunity for the ACT to really lead the way. And we also want to have some travel incentives for zero-emission vehicles, like being able to use transit lanes, regardless of the number of passengers. So these things will really help, we think, in helping people to make that transition away from fossil fuel to electric vehicles.
Great, thanks so much. Emma, I'm going to go to Candice now.
Yeah, so once again, we think that it comes down to making sure that we are investing in public transport. We are investing in cycleways. We are doing whatever we can to allow Canberrans to make those choices. We believe in incentives and not sanctions. So we don't want to see things banned, like we don't want to see cars banned. We don't want to see toll roads introduced in our city. We do acknowledge that there are some Canberra families who do at the moment continue to need to rely on their vehicles, and we don't think that those people should be punished. I would suggest that some of the tax breaks and things that Chris Steele did mention, they are just tax breaks for the rich. Electric vehicles, unfortunately, the truth is that they are still out of the range of, they're not affordable to most Canberra families. As much as Canberrans are environmentally conscious people, we know that Canberrans are environmentally conscious people, and they want to make the best decisions when they can. Unfortunately, at the moment, electric vehicles are just something that's beyond most families' budgets. The Canberra Liberals want to lower the cost of living for Canberra families, and we want to do that through a whole heap of things, including our rates freeze guarantee and through reducing vehicle registrations. And as I said, because we do know that Canberrans are environmentally conscious, we do also know that if they have more money to spend on the things that really matter to them, they will be more inclined to make those kinds of decisions. So we want to lower the cost of living to better support Canberra families.
Great, thank you, Candice. And I'm going to throw for the last response to Robert.
Yeah, sure. Of course, the Canberra Progressives are interested in exploring incentives of how we encourage uptake of electric vehicles. One of the things that we'd look at is probably in line with what Minister Steele outlined, which is registration discounts for electric vehicles. The thing I'd probably throw back to is that electric car dependency is still car dependency. So one of the big things that we're really interested in is rebalancing Canberra's transport priorities away from private motor vehicle use and towards public and active transport. So that there's a pretty comprehensive strategy that's behind that. But again, yes, we do need to reduce the emissions of our private motor vehicle use, which will be around for some time yet. But it's going to take some time to get there. So I think the strategy of incentivising the uptake of electric vehicles, allowing the market, it is the wealthier people who are going to buy these things initially. But as it's obviously with the economies of scale, as more and more people take these up, the electric vehicles become more and more affordable. So yeah, I think we can take that approach so long as we're taking that comprehensive approach to rebalance the entire system.
Great, thanks so much, Robert. We've had about probably 6 pages of questions come in from the floor, and we've been busy trying to collate them. So I think what we might do is throw to some of the questions that people have actually been pitching. Please forgive me if I don't do things so comprehensively in order. And also, I guess, if you feel like you don't wish to respond to a question, then don't feel that you have to, but I'll obviously give you the opportunity to, and I'll try and rotate the speaking order as we go. So I think I'm going to start off with some questions about, sorry, I'll just go in here, about light rail. And one of the recurring themes that is coming up around light rail is around technology choices. And around the use of trackless trams. Why are we continuing with them? Isn't light rail too expensive? I'm sure that you're all reasonably familiar with the proposition, so I won't unpack it any more than that. But the question is about your party's commitment to the technology. Why are you committing to that technology, and what thought might you have given to using other technologies, I suspect, for those major transport spines across Canberra? I'm going to start this round by asking Emma to go first, and then I'll rotate from there. So Emma, if you want to kick off, and if I'll just keep going around in circles.
Look, I think it's really important to note that we've already got a great start on our light rail network with Gungahlin to the city. Now, if we were to switch to a different technology for the next stage, we're going to end up with, I don't know if anyone, can sort of picture what Australia was like in the early days of Federation, with different rail gauges and different rail systems in every state. I grew up close to Albury-Wodonga rail station. They had the longest train network in the platform in the southern hemisphere for a while there because of that. So look, we've already got a start with a particular technology, and I think it's really important to note that. I think it's also really important to note the difference between light rail and buses in terms of how it impacts on urban development. When you've got a light rail system laid down, you know that there is going to be good access to public transport along that route for, pretty much the rest of your life. As we've seen with Network 19 though, bus routes can change, and you can have people that are completely dependent on catching buses who move to a particular area because they think they're going to be able to get to where they need to go, and then the bus route changes and they can't get there. So giving people some certainty that they will have access to that public transport system into the future is really important as well.
Great, thanks Emma. Candice, before you keep going, sorry to do this to you, Emma, I'm just trying to get across all of these questions, but before you keep going, Candice, I'm just going to throw another couple of little bits in the mix for you that you might like to respond to while you have the opportunity. I guess the question is, well, somebody's put the question about when does light rail become unviable in terms of the cost? I guess that's probably a difficult question to answer, and they've put 1.5 billion, 1.7, when does it become unviable? I'm just trying to see if there's anything else there particularly. No, I think that's probably about it. So I'll throw back to that, and also back to that general question about, why light rail and why not other technologies? And the other issue that has been raised in the chat bar is around the speed of light rail for the routes versus other options, or the speed of the transit. Yeah, you know what I mean. Not the speed of construction, the speed of the actual vehicles.
Okay. When it comes to technology, I think transport in particular is an area at the moment where there is a lot of rapidly changing and emerging technology. And I think it is absolutely important to be open-minded and to assess all of those options. And I don't think that any option should necessarily be off the table. I also don't think there's any reason why it has to be one or the other. We are a growing city, and there's no reason why we can't have an integrated system that still uses a mix of different technologies across the network. So I think it is important to assess each of those on their own merits. In terms of the cost of light rail, it's not just about the figure of the cost that we can say, oh, it's viable at this point, it's viable at that point. No, it's about the cost benefit analysis. So the benefit is, of course, just as important. With light rail stage 1, we saw prior to COVID an increase in public transport patronage of 5%. So that does still seem like a huge amount of money for a 5% increase in patronage. So that's why we need to see the cost benefit analysis. We need to be assessing both sides of the coin to make sure that if we are making that investment, Canberrans and ratepayers are actually getting value for money, and it's going to be a worthwhile investment.
Great, thanks Candice. I'm going to throw to Robert, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, sure. So before the last election, I wrote a paper, or wrote in the Riot Act, an article called Why Rails Instead of Rubber? It's based on the study that I had been doing on light rail systems around the world, particularly in North America, noting that North America has a similar urban development pattern as Canberra and some parts of Australia as well. We think that rail-based transport trumps any sort of road-based transport, whether that be trackless tram, which is just another name for a bus, or buses, because it sends a signal to private investors and also to the public of certainty of public investment in that route. So one of the key things that light rail can do is lead to a transformation in land use, an intensification, and basically a better uptake of a public transport. When the Gold Coast Light Rail opened, it was a full 21% increase in public transport usage uptake across the network, not just on the light rail, which was a result. When Minneapolis did a similar thing, a full 40% of people surveyed on the new lines that were installed were first-time public transport users. So light rail, rail-based transport has an attraction factor that buses simply don't have. So I think it's the right technology if we want to start changing from a sprawling suburban car-dependent city to a tight-knit, walkable public transport using place. That's where we stand.
Great, thanks so much, Robert. And over to Chris. Chris, before you kick off, I'm going to throw you a couple of questions. You are in government and the minister, so it's probably fair to throw some of these at you in terms of they've come specifically directed at you. So is that okay with you?
Yep.
Right. So a couple of the questions in the chat bar are that you're going to the election with a commitment to build a new light rail stage every decade. That means it'll be another 30 years. By the way, I'm not saying this is accurate. I'm just reading the question out for you. But the question is it not too slow, 30 years, given more extensive networks have been built in shorter times elsewhere? And then the other question that's come up for specifically is that, are we accepting that light rail, the actual journey time will be slower than using buses? And those are the two specifics that I'm going to direct your way, as well as the general question about technology. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks. Well, I'll start with there's a lot in there, but I'll start with the trackless scams, as they have been called. They are really just buses, and they would not deliver the same benefits that we're seeing with light rail on stage one, which we want to extend so that we've got a north-south spine to the whole of Canberra with further extensions as part of our light rail master plan. We know that some of the same costs would apply with a trackless tram project. We've examined what those costs might be. The actual cost of a track slab that is required for light rail is a very small part of the overall cost of our transport project, like light rail. It's the cost of moving utilities. It's all of the other costs that would be required that would still apply to a trackless tram system. So it's not necessarily all that cheaper. And what we know is that light rail generates the benefits, the land use benefits, the transportation benefits that we've seen on stage one. If you go up Northbourne Avenue, it's pretty clear that it's having an effect on the way that people want to live and work around light rail. That's very obvious. And we want to see the same patronage benefits that we've seen, the increase, actually, to counter Candice's point, I think it was up around 11% just prior to the pandemic overall in Canberra, but up 32% in Gungahlin and up over 20% in the inner north. So it really has an effect on people, behavioural effect that buses have never delivered on the same route. And that's the same effect that we want to have it down to Woden. People know that how long it takes to get to Gungahlin on the light rail, and they can expect that over a 14-kilometre route that it'll just be slightly longer than that. And that's what we're expecting. We'll have more to say about the exact timing of the connection once the design reaches a more mature stage, like we did with stage one. But we've already factored that into the business case, and it's clear to see the benefits there in terms of transportation, land use, and other wider economic benefits as well that we've provided. First stage came in under budget, of course, and has delivered higher than expected patronage with 15,000 trips a day, and we're hopeful that we can deliver a good value for money outcome on stage two as we go through the procurement process for that part of the project. This is about planning for the future. We've outlined that in our transport strategy, which is future focused, because this is going to benefit people for decades to come. And so it is right to debt fund this work, particularly at the moment when the chairman of the Reserve Bank has told states that we need to be investing an extra $40 billion in infrastructure to make sure that we're protecting and creating jobs, as well as delivering good projects that are value for money, and in this case, deliver better public transport for our city.
Great, thank you, Chris. I'm going to change directions completely. And this one's, Candice, this goes to you first. And it's a question that's come up both under cycling and it's come up under walking, which is a question about residential speed limits and positions on what residential speed limits you would support. In terms of, there's obviously the international standard around 30-kilometre-hour speed limits in residential areas. In many overseas countries, somebody says 40 kilometres an hour as well. So just wonder if candidates would like to comment on what they think is an appropriate policy with regards to improving safety in residential areas for active travel like cycling and walking. So Candice first, then Robert, then Chris, then Emma.
Yeah, in terms of areas that do have high pedestrian foot traffic, we would support lower speed limits in some of those areas. But I also note that there are some areas at the moment that do already have lower speed limits because they have high pedestrian traffic around shops and that, where the signage in that is so terrible that a lot of motorists don't notice anyway. And there is still a lot of safety concerns in those areas. I think that one of the big issues here is the lack of enforcement as well of speeding on our roads, not just the speed limits themselves, but the lack of enforcement of those speed limits. And that largely comes down to the lack of resourcing of our police. So as we know, police numbers in the ACT haven't risen with population growth since 2012. So the Canberra Liberals have committed to investing in more police officers, which will definitely help with enforcement. We've also committed to flashing lights in our school zones, which is something that happens in a lot of other jurisdictions, to actually alert drivers to when they are entering a school zone and when the school zone is active. So I think that's really important as well to increasing pedestrian safety and child safety in our school zones.
Great, thanks, Candice. I'm going to throw to Robert.
Yeah, sure. So I've seen a saying in urban planning circles, and that is, if you need a sign to slow your cars down, then you've designed your streets wrong. A lot of Canberra's streets have been designed specifically around the priority and the hierarchy of the car, basically. So I know in my suburb in Garran, there's a Gilmore Crescent, it's hugely wide. And what that does is it provides a huge onward line of sight for the driver, and it's a natural instinctive reaction to go quicker in that environment because you've got clear lines of sight. So what I would be advocating for is around these high activity areas, you know, around shopping centres in suburbs, around schools, is narrowing our lanes, changing the road surface, and putting obstructions in the line of sight of the drivers on the sides of the road, such that it actually causes them to slow down. Now, this is a proven methodology that the Dutch have used for their suburban streets. They also have a type of suburban street called the Winerth, which is a shared space between drivers, cyclists, and pedestrians. And I think that in our suburbs, we can go a long way to slowing drivers down simply by better design rather than flashing signs and more enforcement.
Great, thanks, Robert. I'm going to throw to Chris.
Thanks. Well, one of the key principles that we enshrined in the planning strategy, but also in the transport strategy, is this idea of movement and place, that people move through areas differently depending on the street, and that different measures around safety may be required, and different planning approaches and design of streets and public spaces are required in different spaces. And so Clearly, in a local street, we need to have slower speed limits, and then that obviously goes higher depending on when we go up to an orbital link in our city. We've been consulting in government on expanding 40k an hour zones in places like Kurrajong and the city, and there's certainly future scope to design streets better to help slow down traffic. We have a city that was built by the NCDC with very wide streets, and people drive to the conditions, not in many cases, which is often faster than we would like, and doesn't necessarily support walking and cycling in our streets. We've rolled out during the pandemic to try and address this issue, the Slower Streets Initiative, with, of course, working with Pedal Power and with local communities to try and make people more aware that there are people walking and cycling around. So it's not just about speed limits. There are other measures that we can take, and we need to continue to work on that. And as I mentioned before, we're keen to look at the best practice approaches around intersection design, particularly, but also street design, building on what's happening, particularly in Europe, to test out how we can do things better here in the ACT. But we are facing a long legacy of NCDC design that's come before us.
Great, thanks, Chris. And to Emma.
Yeah, look, in some areas, on some streets, lowering the speed limit or installing traffic calming measures to slow the traffic down a little bit could actually be the right solution for that particular street. What I can tell you is this, that over the next 4 years, if we're re-elected, the Greens will develop a 10-year-wide ACT-wide infrastructure priority plan for walking and cycling. And what we want to do as part of that plan is ensure that the community has a real say in the upgrades to their local walking and cycling infrastructure. This ties into the neighbourhood democracy policy that we put out just recently, where we want to engage more with the local community and get local suburbs talking about what actually needs to happen in their area. To engage more with the community who are actually living in the suburb is a good way to find out which are the areas that actually need traffic calming measures or lower speed limits, which areas might need lighting upgrades or footpath maintenance to be improved, which areas might need separated cycle paths from road traffic. It's going to be different things for different areas, but the more we can involve the community in making those decisions, the better those decisions will be for all of us in the long term.
Great, thank you, Emma. I'm going to go to one more general question. Actually, no, I'm going to start firing a couple of specific questions at a couple of people, if that's okay with you. So the first one is around electric buses. There's obviously a difference of opinion between the ALP and the Greens around when we need to stop buying diesel buses. Chris, I would like to throw to you if you'd like to answer that question, and I might go back to Emma. I also I'm sorry, just going to say I have some other specific questions we'll come back to, so thank you. Sorry, Chris.
There is no difference of opinion. I made it very clear in the announcement that we have the expectation that we will be purchasing no new diesel buses, or CNG buses for that matter, from this point forward. And we'll go out before the end of the year and with a market sounding and procure the 90 electric buses as soon as we can. And we need the infrastructure to support it, but we'll get on and start procuring them. There'll be an interim solution before both Woden and the new Northside depot come online to make sure that we can start rolling them out, as we have done with the one behind me, which is the Yutong E12, which is already on the road and travels up to 400 kilometres a day.
Great, thank you, Chris, for clarifying that. Emma, did you feel like you need to add anything to that?
Yeah, look, it's great to hear that you are on board with no more fossil fuel powered buses. Look, one of the things about our bus network at the moment is that around 70% of the routes that these buses are travelling could be done by electric buses now. So there really is no need to be buying any more fossil fuel powered buses.
Great, thanks, Emma. I would like to throw to Candice. Candice, the Liberal Party have put a couple of policies out this week as well with regards to car registration and parking. I wonder how you see policies such as that being aligned with trying to reduce emissions from vehicles, and also thinking about how we use public space for a shift towards active transport and public transport.
Yeah, so this week we have announced that we will lower the rate of vehicle registration in the ACT to save Canberra families up to $200 a year. And that is part of our package to lower the cost of living for Canberrans. This goes hand in hand with all of our transport announcements. So that is not to encourage more people into their cars. As I've said, it's the government who have encouraged more people into their cars by cutting the bus network. And we see the best way of encouraging people out of their cars by improving our public transport network, making sure it is as easy and accessible as possible for people to actually use public transport and depend on public transport, and also increasing our cycleways so that we are making it as safe and convenient as possible for people to use our cycleways and to cycle to and from work as well. However, as I mentioned before, we don't believe that those people who do still need to rely on their cars, as many families still do, we don't think that those people should be punished for it, as has often been the case under this Labor Greens government. We want to lower the cost of living for Canberra families, and we want to empower people to make their own decisions when it comes to environmental consciousness, as I'm sure a large number of Canberrans will choose to do.
Can I jump in there, Helen? I just want to answer a point that was raised there by Candice.
Yep, no worries.
So,
Rob.
yes.
I have a specific question for you. So
yeah, sure. So I just want to talk about that point where, in one hand, we're making it easier for people to drive. We're talking about discounted registrations and more parking availability and all that sort of stuff. So on the one hand, we're inducing demand, and that's non-discriminatory. It's anyone can use these facilities or these policies. And on the other hand, you're saying you want more people to get into public transport. When people buy a car, it's a sunk cost. It's an investment they've made. If they're incentivized to use it more, then they're going to use it more. They're not going to go into public transport. So I think there's a little bit of a cognitive dissonance going on with those two policies. And I appreciate what the Liberals are trying to do with the active and public transport initiatives, but I just think there's a disconnect that needs to be addressed.
Car registration has increased by, I think it's around 40% since Andrew Barr became Treasurer. And that's alongside all of the huge increases that Canberrans have seen in rates and in cost of living. We don't think that that is fair. And what we are hearing from Canberrans time and time again is that they can no longer afford to live in our city. Too many people are being pushed over the border because it is too expensive to live here. We don't think that that's fair, and we want to bring down the cost of living for Canberra families. I accept what you're saying, but I do believe it is about incentives, and it's about creating the right public transport network and active travel infrastructure that enables Canberrans to make that choice without forcing people into one thing or the other. And I do think, again, the way the government has increased car registration and continues to abolish parking spaces is just punishing those people who there are lots of people, and I mean, as Ian Ross said earlier as well, we accept there are lots of people who cycling isn't a viable option in their daily commute. Public transport isn't a viable option. If they're taking their kids to and from school or childcare or making stops along the way, that's not necessarily a viable option. So I don't think that we should be punishing those people by continuing to push up the cost of living when they already face such huge cost of living pressures in our city.
Candice, I'm just going to get you to wrap up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay, I've got one more specific question for Emma, and then I'd like to go back to some general questions for all of you. Emma, the Greens announced a policy this week around express tram services from on the new light rail route. I wonder if you could quickly unpack that, because I can see that from the commentary there was quite a bit of debate around it.
Sure. Look, what that's about is trying to make that light rail route useful to as many people as possible. Part of making that useful is making sure that it's the quickest way to get from Woden to the city. Now, some people are going to want to travel from Woden straight to the city, and they're not going to want to have to stop at every station along the way. And so having some of those services be express services, will enable those people to get there quicker. There are going to be other people who actually don't want to go all the way to the city and might want to get off a little earlier. And so we don't want to make all of the services express services. So it's about trying to make the system work for the maximum number of people. Now, there are some things that can be done in the planning for light rail stage 2 that will enable that to be easier. So it's things like allowing trains to overtake each other at some of the stations. It doesn't have to be at every station, but if there are some stations where one can overtake the other, then that will enable that express service to work. And you can actually cut about 5 minutes just by timetabling. So there's a lot that can be done in the planning for light rail to make sure that it will work for the maximum number of people.
Great, thanks.
Just on that one, can I jump in on
Yes,
that
please
one?
do. Yep.
There just literally is not the room to be able to do this. Light rail, the peak times runs every 5 minutes, and will do down to Woden during the peak times. So when you're at a station, you can actually see the next light rail vehicle coming up. And if you try to run express services, then what you'll get is bunching up. Now, it doesn't matter whether you put in overtaking lanes on some of the stations. This is a network that interacts with the road network as well on places like State Circle. So you'll get bunching up at traffic lights. You will get that, and we do have a system of providing priority to light rail vehicles, but it still interacts with the road network, and that's impossible to avoid. So I'm not sure where this idea has come from, but it's just not going to work on light rail. We want to provide frequent, accessible public transport, mass transport, to move as many people efficiently as possible through this transport corridor. We've seen that in light rail stage 1, where we've got 13 stops. We can do it on light rail stage 2 and not leave people behind in the suburbs of Hughes, Curtin, Deakin, and Yarralumla. So this is an important project, and we want to get the planning right. And express services just do not take place around the world. And I'd like you to mention just one example of light rail express services that run every 5 minutes at peak times. You could do it if you ran every 30 minutes, but not every 5.
Yeah, look, I think it's vitally important, if we're going to make the Woden to City light rail route work, that light rail is quicker than taking the bus and quicker than getting in your car. If it's not, then it's going to be very hard for people to justify switching to public transport instead of driving their car. So if we can make it work for people, then that will get more use out of it, and that will be a better outcome for all of us.
It already isn't quicker on the city to Gungahlin, but people still use it in droves, and it's very efficient.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm just going to draw a line under that one. Thank you both for responding to that. It's really helpful to hear your different perspectives on it. I'm going to go back to a more general question for all of the candidates around equity. And there was a question that was in the chat bar, which I've just seemed to have lost. But the broader question really is, how will your party improve transport equity across the ACT? And what are some of the things that you think would be appropriate policies in terms of ensuring that low-income households are supported potentially with that transition to a zero emissions transport system? We know that the zero emissions pathway involves transitioning technologies and appliances, and that extends from cars to households. What are your thoughts around how we support people through that transition? I'm sorry, I forgot to do my order. I'm going to throw to Robert first. Sorry, no, I'm not Robert.
Oh,
yes, I am.
No. You are?
I've run it.
Okay.
It's you, Chris. Sorry.
No worries. Look, this is a really good question. First thing that we've done is freeze public transport fares for 2 years to help make it more accessible, particularly given the current circumstances that we're in, where people are doing it tough, and even though there's less people using public transport, many people do rely on it as well. The other thing is, I think what's important about our system here in the ACT is that we don't have zone-based fares. The same charge is applied no matter how far away you live. whether it's in Tuggeranong or Gungahlin, we're not charging people extra. And I think that goes to the other question in relation to electric vehicles. We've got to be very careful that we don't charge people extra who who simply live too far away or further away than others. And that goes to the transition to different models for road user charging. We've got to be very careful that we're not taxing people who can't afford it. And that's critical in any model that goes forward. And that work is being done nationally by all different parties and all different governments working together. But we need to make sure that there's a system that doesn't penalise people. The other thing is, like, we really need to make sure that the tax and transfer system federally actually puts money in people's pockets, as it has done during the pandemic, to support people to actually afford these things. That is critical, and that would be the most effective thing here to address this. But the ACT government, if Labor's elected, will make sure that we're not putting up extra costs and make sure that public transport is a viable and accessible alternative to using a car and bringing down costs.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. I'm going to go to Emma.
Yeah, look, equity is vitally important in making sure that our city works. Paths maintenance is a big part of that, making sure that everyone feels safe in our neighbourhoods, that there is an active travel option that everyone can get access to that works for them. The other thing too is, making sure that public transport is accessible to everyone. And this is where, work of people like Caroline Lakuta is so important. As a crossbench member, she was able to ask questions about what happened after the Network 19 changes. And her ability to do that meant that we had a better understanding of the impact of that on the south side, how that impacted on Woden and Tuggeranong people who lost access to bus timetables that had worked for them previously and reduced the number of public transport trips they were taking. Now, without having access to that information, it's much harder for us to identify where improvements might be needed. One of the other things that the Greens want to do is create an access committee to give a clear mechanism for feedback from people with disabilities to the ACT government on things like active travel and urban planning and transport design issues. And we also want more neighbourhood democracy. So by having neighbourhood democracy programs where the community can talk about what's needed in their area, and directorates might need to come back to them and say, hey, here's what's already been planned, here's what's coming up in future. That might result in more information being made publicly available so that we can have more equitable decision making and more community engagement with that.
Great, thanks so much, Emma. Candice?
Yeah, we will make the public transport system more accessible. So we will fix Labor's transport bungles. As I mentioned earlier, since Network 19 came in, we have seen cuts to dedicated school services, cuts to commuter services, cuts to weekend services, cuts to bus stops. All of these changes have disadvantaged those who were already at a disadvantage in our community. The elderly people in our community who have lost their local bus stop and they're now expected to walk over a kilometre makes public transport inaccessible to those people. Stressed families who lost their commuting service and now have to spend an extra 7.5 hours a week commuting to and from work. Lost school services and families have been forced back in their cars to get to and from school. And of course, mobility impaired people and weekend workers as well, with the cuts to the weekend network that the government couldn't deliver on. We've seen that have a huge impact on a lot of people who work shifts or who work over the weekend. So we need to make our public transport system as accessible and reliable as possible so that it is equitable and those people aren't being disadvantaged.
I guess I'll jump in there.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I've studied this problem of transport disadvantage a little bit, and I think in the nature of a city like Canberra, a sprawling suburban low-density sort of layout, we tend to see that the most affordable housing is on our outskirts, and by living on our outskirts, those people by the nature of being there, have the highest transport costs because they got the longest trips to get anywhere, to do anything, jobs, shops, communal activities, etc. And I think the recent removal of public housing tenants from Northbourne Avenue and pushing them out to the outskirts has somewhat exacerbated this situation in Canberra. So I think what we really need to do is look at an effective network, a public transport network where we have high frequency, rapid routes to just about every corner of the city, and looking at addressing that last mile problem. It's a vexed issue. Maybe we don't need to have a traditional bus service to sort out that last mile system, perhaps through that integrated active transport policy that we're looking at investigating. Perhaps we can look at people riding from where they are on the outskirts to a trunk route node where they can lock up their transport and take a rapid route into where they need to be. There's a number of questions to unpack there, and probably not enough to look at in a 2.5 minute period, but I think we can do better than we do.
Great, thank you, Robert. I'm going to make that our last question for the evening. We've just hit on 7 o'clock. I just wanted to acknowledge that there are many, many, many more questions than we were able to put to candidates today. Everything from chip seal through to why people don't cut their vegetation back off the footpaths and allow proper footpath access, including some more questions around sort of transport policy. We will cut and paste the chat so that we can retain some of those questions and some of that content that people have put in. It's always a very dynamic group, the people who are interested in transport policy in the ACT, and there's a lot of expertise in the community as well. So we really appreciate everybody who's turned up tonight. We had over 115 participants at one point during the conversation tonight. So it's certainly a worthwhile event to be holding, I think, for people to find out more. I'd like to give a very warm thank you to all of the candidates who are running for election. I know some of you are old hands and some of you are new at it. I think all of you are old hands at campaigning. And some of you are MLAs and some of you have not yet made that yet. But there's no doubt that putting your hand up to go into public office is a huge commitment, and it's not something that everybody wants to do. So I think, as a community, it's great that you're prepared to take time out and talk to your constituents and let us know what your policies are. And we really appreciate the time that you've put aside to do that today. For those of you who don't know, the Conservation Council is a fairly small not-for-profit organisation. I'd like to say thank you to all of those people who made a donation at the iDoor when you registered. We really do appreciate the contributions you made. So thank you so much. Some of them were small, some of them were big, but they all make a big difference. If anybody's inspired to become a regular donor, we'd love you to do that as well. I can see Warwick's giving me a big cheesy grin, but I've got to take every opportunity I can, Warwick. There are some very wonderful not-for-profit organisations in this town that people can contribute to. But if you've enjoyed this event and if you enjoy the other events that we run, we would love to have your ongoing support. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you to also our co-host groups, Public Transport Canberra, Public Transport Association Canberra, Electric Vehicles Association at the ACT branch, Living Streets Canberra, and also Pedal Power ACT for joining us on this platform tonight and for promoting this event to their member groups as well. It's great fun working with all the transport groups who really enjoy the conversations that we have. So thank you for being part of the Conservation Council, and also thanks for being here this evening. I'm sure there'll be more announcements to come, so stay posted on our Facebook page. We're trying to announce the announcements as they come through, as are a lot of the other groups. And we'll also be doing some analysis and assessment of policies as we get closer to the election. So if you'd like to come back to looking at what we put forward and what we think the parties are delivering, then we appreciate you coming back in to our website, or you can get onto our email list and stay updated that way. So on that note, I'm going to say goodnight to everybody and hand over to Kirsten, and Kirsten will magically end the whole meeting. So thank you very much for your time once again.
Thank you.